I'm going to break down some of the ideas of the three mythological scholars, I'm going to call them. And obviously this is my summary. It's quite a subjective area, isn't it? And so this is my interpretation of their ideas, but don't take me at my word, go out and read what they have to say. I have done my best to try and be as objective in representing their ideas as I can, but I'm a limited human being and I can make mistakes. So here is what I believe Carl Jung believed about order and chaos. So it's worth mentioning as well that yes, Swiss psychiatrist, student of Sigmund Freud, the creator of psychoanalysis and the psychodynamic approach, and the father of psychology, the grandfather being Wilhelm Wundt, who set up the first experimental lab. But yes, he was also the founder of analytical psychology, Jung that is, and he saw order and chaos as fundamental psychological forces within the individual. So my understanding of this kind of presages my understanding of Jung, in that I read Jung after I came up with my own notion, but it seems like actually I'm agreeing with him in this respect. So he believed that order, represented by the conscious mind, and chaos, represented by the unconscious, are in a constant sort of dynamic relationship with one another. And he saw integration of the sort of competing forces and finding balance as essential for psychological health, I suppose you could say, or psychological well-being, however you want to define it, but I think you know what I mean. And he in particular emphasized the process of individuation, in which an individual integrates their conscious and unconscious aspects to achieve a form of self-realization, which is actually kind of what we were talking about at the start, wasn't it? And so I very much like this means of talking about this, because although he's sort of the one that helped define the modern views on mythology, he takes a sort of left of field approach. Obviously, it's much, much broader than that. It was more or less his life's works, but this is my sort of summary and perhaps what is most unique about his interpretation, because of course, people have been trying to understand mythology since they have been created. So it's unfair to attribute everything to one thinker, because everyone inherits from their forebears. And so I think we have a tendency as a civilization to attribute too much to the great men of history.
Okay.
And that in many ways, they're just carrying on what seems like a natural continuation of something. I think of this especially in music, like people say, oh, the Beatles changed music, but not really. I mean, they're my favorite band and everything, but they had lots of bands that they were building from. And if you know the influences that they had, well, it's not a surprise that they did what they did. And that, I think the same goes for ideas as well.
Yep. I really like that you put the adjective analytical psychology, because you could say that every philosopher before that was also doing psychology. And Plato, for instance, Aristotle, Descartes, all of them, they were engaged in an endeavor that is frequently described as rational psychology, that many empiricists want to part with afterwards. And they want to put forward a different understanding of the mind, where they want to say that in order for the mind to be scientifically understood, it needs to obey some rigid laws. And they part with a lot of the conceptual machinery that is inbuilt into rational psychology.
I've actually found that the sort of pre-creation of psychology as a formal discipline philosophy that looks at the psychological is quite useful in sort of navigating where a research interest would be useful. And so, I mean, that tends to be the case with a lot of philosophy, in that it tends to be the reasoning and the sort of, what's the word? Sort of framework for which you approach scientific problems in the first place, which is why I've had to study and read so much philosophy.
I think framework is a good word.
So moving on to Joseph Campbell.
Can I ask you something about you before we move to Campbell? When you said that he saw the integration between chaos and order as essential for psychological health, in what sense would he do this? Would he do this in the sense of ontological chaos and order, or perceived chaos and order?
I think he basically characterized the conscious mind and the unconscious mind as representing each order and chaos, the conscious one being order and the unconscious being chaos. And by balancing the two, what he means is that one doesn't have too much dominion over the other.
Yeah.
And I think that knowing what we know in modernity about sort of neuroscience, we know that the conscious mind is, it feels like it's in control, but it is, in my opinion, this is still a matter of debate, but it is the subservient force to the unconscious mind, because the unconscious mind quite often is the one that feeds information to the conscious one, because the unconscious mind is much more quick and efficient, and also is the one that processes a lot of your sensory stimuli. And so if that's the source of the information that your conscious mind gets, then you would have to say, well, the consciousness is sort of downstream from unconsciousness, which makes sense when you look at it from a sort of evolutionary perspective, because we clearly were unconscious beings before we became conscious. And of course, primates can exist being unconscious, even though they have similarities with us. I wouldn't call any other non-human animal truly conscious in the human sense, which is a distinction that's very common in psychology. I do get some people calling me out, calling me out saying, oh, my dog's conscious. And I mean, there are degrees of it, right? In that, you know, a snail is less conscious than a dog. I think that's fair to say. But I think there has to be certain criteria that a species has to meet to be truly conscious. And so that's where I tend to draw the line. But I think what Jung is trying to say is that you're trying to basically get the best out of your conscious and unconscious mind. And he might not have put it quite in those terms, but he's trying to say that when you are making a decision, you kind of play to the strengths of each side of your mind, if you will.
Each tendency and each
aspect
of the mind.
Say if you're listening to music, it makes sense not to sit there and break down, oh, that was a C sharp to an A, an A chord or whatever. I really liked that. You just sit and listen to it. You let the experience wash over you rather than consciously and deliberately trying to figure everything out for your consciously. And that what situation you're in depends on which faculty you employ. And I think that that's probably what Jung was getting at. But as I've said before, I've not read his entire work. I mean, he had an entire life's work. It would probably take me months and months, if not years of my life to understand.
He was very prolific.
He was, yeah. And so I could be slightly misunderstanding or misrepresenting it, or maybe, as with many intellectuals, he had periods throughout his career where he believed certain things that he no longer believed. And so, take it with a pinch of salt, as I said before. So moving on to Campbell. He was an American mythologist, I think is fair to say, who focused on universal patterns and themes between different mythologies. And he viewed order and chaos as integral components of the hero's journey, which is, by his understanding, and I certainly agree, a recurring mythological motif. And I think that's, I don't know whether you agree with that as well. That
is he the psychologist who has a
He's not a psychologist.
Okay, but has he written a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces?
He may well have done. That does sound familiar.
I've heard is a masterpiece.
I'm just Googling it now. Apologies, people at home. But no, it does sound
Campbell.
right. Yes.
Okay.
I have
instant respect.
I have heard many good things about that, and I think Peterson might have actually talked about that book before. Although Peterson does have his distinctions between Campbell, although there is a lot in common with them, and I imagine they would probably get along quite well if they were put in a room together. But he said that heroes undergo a transformative journey, moving from the familiar and ordered world into the chaotic and unknown realm, where they face challenges and gain wisdom, confronting chaos and integrating the lessons from that, and they bring back a sort of new order to the world that they left behind, sort of wisdom, something that is external to the civilization beforehand, and adds value and solidifies the order which existed before, or builds upon it, or perhaps even replaces it with an even what's the word? A better order, I suppose you could say, although that's not the perfect
This
word.
is definitely a theme that takes place in Hesiod, which I know that we are going to discuss in a bit.
Yes.
But I want to say that it seems to me that there is a really interesting topic that emerges here, because the hero is supposed to be a sort of archetype or a symbol.
Yes.
And it is not necessarily, the way I understand it, the hero is not necessarily the mightiest warrior, or, you know, the more the person who slays the dragon.
They're not necessarily the best of their civilization.
Yeah,
always.
It seems to me to be functioning as a symbol for what is best within each person.
Yes.
In the idea that, you know, everyone can be the hero in their own story. Everyone can be the hero in their own narrative. And I think that this is a way of focusing on achieving a sort of just internal order. And again, I'm stressing this from a wisdom perspective, because I'm really interested in understanding the notion of wisdom. There is an idea that we appeal to our wisdom in order to grasp the order of the world and understand, grasp also the moral order of the world, our internal order, and try to use that in order to achieve the best life possible for us. A sort of merging of all these orders and try to see how to move in it. And I think that the hero functions as a symbol of how to navigate within a world for each individual person.
I agree with you, but I would put it in ever so slightly different terms. So I would say that the hero is meant to be a sort of placeholder for the person who the story is being told to, in that usually they're meant to be a character in which the person following the story identifies with. And so through them identifying with the person in the story, you know, they're not necessarily a real person in the mythological sense, or the sort of objective historical sense, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is that you're putting yourself in a frame of mind that may actually be quite unfamiliar to you, but because the sort of the criteria of the story tends to push people out of their comfort zones and make them confront things in which they might be unfamiliar, they can get psychological benefits from that. They can learn lessons and morals from stories, which is why you have things like Aesop's fables, like they're short stories that have a moral to them. And that's part of the reason why children's stories are as they are. The notion is that you tell them stories that tell them something about the world and how they should respond to it. That's why many children's stories seem to have a moral to the story. You don't tend to have very amoral or immoral, well, it depends which US state you're in, stories given to children. Or at least you shouldn't. But yes, another thing that Campbell emphasized was he really liked to emphasize the sort of transformative power of myth and storytelling in humanity. And this is something that Peterson, again, sort of agrees with Campbell on. And I've heard Peterson say basically exactly these sorts of things, that stories are very, very important.
Yeah.
And it's a means of having the benefits of experience without actually having to physically experience something. It's in a similar sort of notion in a way. I did a Contemplations talking about dreams, that dreams provide people with the opportunity to be in circumstances that would be sort of life or death. And they give you a certain, once you've been exposed to them enough, a certain comfort with them to the point whereby you may well be able to better experience them in real life and deal with them appropriately because you've had these sort of generated experiences, mentally speaking, that help you with it. And there is a bleed over to that in that I've noticed this just in myself, that when I used to have dreams when I was quite young, close to being a child, where I was scared of being eaten by loads of zombies. And I think that probably playing lots of video games didn't do me much good there. But I had those dreams so often that now there's absolutely nothing scary about that sort of thing. When I have a dream of a zombie apocalypse, I feel so competent and able to survive because I've been exposed to those dreams so much. And I mean, if that ever comes up in real life, I feel like I'm the man. I've got all my prepping gear. I've got all the survivalism skills, so I'm sorted. I suppose that is an element of it as well, right? It's not just that the dreams expose me to something, but the dream here in this example is like an analogy for a story, because you're conjuring up images in your head, be it conscious or unconscious. The process is still similar or the same, I would say. Certainly using different neurological areas when you're conscious and unconscious, but the psychological reasoning for it being good, as well as the benefits thereof, are very much comparable, in my opinion.
And I want to add that stories have a unique way of conveying a message, especially myths, conveying a message in a way that engages us as whole persons. They're not just directed to our minds, as, very abstract philosophy does. They are not just about, links between propositions. They're about people. And the more symbols they involve, the more we seem to be able to identify with a person in that story. And it's really interesting to see also why, for instance, Peterson and Campbell, they had so much of a following in comparison to people who just talk about things in the abstract.
Yeah, well, it's
I think this has to do something with it.
Mm-hmm. I think stories are emotionally engaging, aren't they? That's part of the whole point of people telling stories, is that they engage the people that they're talking to. And so if they're emotionally engaging, that makes them interesting, as well as, that stories can also be intellectually engaging simultaneously. And I think all the best stories are both intellectually and emotionally engaging. To kind of conjure up Jung again, you're striking a balance between the conscious and the unconscious. Yeah. So I think that's why all of the best stories, all of the best art, all of the best culture kind of stimulates both parts of the mind.
Yep.
So I wanted to read a brief quote from Campbell, just to kind of give it a bit of a summary here about his views on order and chaos as well. As a lot of that is sort of talking about elements of mythology rather than order and chaos. And he says, "When we talk about setting the world's problems, we're barking up the wrong tree. The world is perfect. It's a mess. It always has been a mess. We're not going to change it. Our job is to straighten out our own lives." I mean,
what a perfect mess.
Yeah. I quite like that in a way, because it's not saying it's perfect, but it's ideal for human flourishing. It's saying the world is how it is, but it's perfect in its own sense, and our focus should be on making ourselves better suited to the world rather than the other way around. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think that's also something that Peterson's been very vocal about as well. And I think is one of his more profound points. Of course, attributing it to either person, I think people have said this sort of thing before.
This raises really interesting questions about our relation to nature. And I must say that in some cases, I don't know if I buy into the rationale of what he said, because in some cases, it seems to me that we do want to change the world so as it to be better for us.
I think
I'm sure he would find a way of saying that, that
I think
he could incorporate that in his theory.
I think I might be slightly mischaracterizing it, because my sort of, if I were to be as specific as possible with what I mean by sort of the world is a mess and straightening out, but it's actually perfect, is that we shouldn't put too much emotional stock on the state of the world. In that the world's always been a mess, and it probably always will be. And so we should focus on what we can do ourselves, because if we focus on our individual agency, not only does that give us the greatest meaning, it also gives us a sort of greater view of which path to take through life.
Yep. Okay. No, that makes much more sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But of course, you would have to do a lot of studying of Campbell to really know what he means by these things. But I haven't, unfortunately, had months and months of my time to dedicate to doing that. But I've done the best with the time I have. And so Peterson, he argues that order and chaos are archetypal forces deeply embedded in human nature. This is similar to Jung in a sense. And he sees order as necessary for stability, hierarchy, preservation of social structures and things like that. And chaos represents the unknown, the unpredictable, the destructive aspects of existence. And I'm a lot more confident with summarizing what Peterson thinks because I have read some of his books as well as listened to hundreds of hours of his lectures. Even before the pronoun thing, I actually I listened to one of Peterson's lectures as supplementary sort of listening when I was studying personality at university in like 2016. And obviously the thing that shot him to stardom was about 2017 with the Bill C16 stuff. And so being a hipster here, it's like, I was listening to him before he was cool. But no, it was just a weird coincidence. And actually I didn't put two and two together until much later. It's just like, hey, isn't that guy I was listening to talking about personality?
Yep.
But there we go. He also, of course, Peterson, and I think this is one of the more unique aspects to him, although I don't think Jung or Campbell would necessarily disagree with him. It's almost like I see the three thinkers as almost like musicians. They could play the same notes, but they put emphases on different parts of the sequence, right?
They would put their character into what they're doing.
Yes. It's almost like, you know how you have different orchestras covering a classical piece. Each one kind of interprets it in a slightly different way, even though they're singing off of the same hymn sheet, so to speak. I'm layering this in so many levels of pun here that
I think this is a really interesting feature of thought, because very frequently, in order to think of how we approach new thinkers, there is we are confronted with a sort of chaos of the tradition of thought, and we don't know how to connect all, who said what, when, how. It's all a chaos. Very frequently, in order to set in order our understanding of it, we make some generalizations, such as, for instance, we talk about early modern philosophy. We say, well, we have the three rationalists. It's Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. And we have the three empiricists. It's Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. But if we read closely into what they're saying, we will see that they are far more different with each other than what this order suggests they are.
There's so much mention of the word order here. I feel like I'm in British Parliament, like order, that sort of thing.
It is a way of it's again a way of trying to understand things. It's again a way of trying to understand who said what, when, and how. And in order to do this, we frequently give an appearance of order. When you want to convey, let's say, when you want to teach early modern philosophy to people who haven't heard it before, you frequently say this because it's a way of people understanding, roughly speaking, something. But it's a sort of stage that needs to be superseded, a ladder that needs to be kicked off after you.
I've always conceptualized learning about new things is a bit like a tree. Yeah. In that, at first you want to have a sturdy trunk, which is like the sort of superficial understanding. And then only once you've got that, can you then spin out into lots of different directions. You need a sort of stable foundation to then approach the complexity of something, because if you have no frame of reference, then it's very difficult to understand the sort of idiosyncrasies, the complexity, the nuance of certain differences in specific philosophical schools of thought.
Yep.
I hope you enjoyed that segment from Contemplations, my series. And if you want to watch the full conversation, which that was taken from, all you need to do is sign up to our website for £5 a month, and you can watch all of the content we have there. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.